Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about 1984, Chapter 3, Part 2. If you guys remember last time, Chapter 3, Part 1 was the introduction right after Winston got arrested at his room at Sherrington's shop. So in Part 1, we discussed his time in the prison, what he's experiencing in there. Doesn't really remember too much on like how he got there, but he's meeting a familiar cast of characters: Ampleforth, Parsons, and eventually O'Brien. And that's where we're going to get to in part 2 here. There is a big dialogue between Winston and O'Brien. It's not going to be the last that they have, but it's a good introduction and some huge eye openers in this chapter. Getting things kicked off here. Right at the beginning, Winston, it said, Orwell writes, Winston has not seen darkness or daylight since the arrest. And he awakes to being on something like a camp bed. So we already know he's in this prison, right? So this really shouldn't be too out of the ordinary, the style of beds that you probably see in like movies where there are prisons. And I just imagine, a bunk bed set up. In this case, I don't think it's like that, but it's just a plain bed. Nothing as comfy as you're going to experience at home. So it's probably pretty miserable. He awakes. O'Brien is now at his side. And he's been beaten multiple times. Remember, part 1 ends with him getting struck on the elbow, and he says how, very painful it was. And what's been happening to Winston is that he's been being forced into confessing to crimes because they have been beating him so much that he is just confessing to anything just to make the beating stop. Whether the crimes are real or they're imaginary, he doesn't care. And it's crazy. It's not just like the beating, it's like the mental beating too, because they'll actually bring in people, he calls them party intellectuals, and they'll beat him, but just with like a constant slight pain. And he mentions how it's about, it's not the physical, but the mental that they put on you. They humiliate him. They destroy his power of arguing and reasoning. They mercilessly question him. They try to trip him up, lay traps for him. They self-contradict. They make him self-contradict himself, not believe in himself anymore, to the point where it says that sometimes he would weep a half a dozen times in a single session. Most of the time, they screamed abuse at him and threatened at every hesitation to deliver him over to the guards again. And then they would switch up. So they would say that, hey, we're gonna give you to the guards. They're gonna beat you so much. And then they would switch up their tune and say, oh, comrade, no, we're just your friend. That flippy floppiness can get to you, can make you confused. And that was what he was saying was the worst part with these party intellectuals beating them. They didn't have the muscle that the guards did, apparently. But then their pain was emotional pain, mental pain. And like I said, Winston's just confessing to everything. Everything he confessed to was quote unquote true, because the party says it was true. So if you did something, then you actually did it. Because again, the party is infallible. And it's easier just to confess to everything. That's what kind of Winston mentions. There was no difference between the thought and the deed. Again, I think what he's getting at here, this is kind of like what thought crime is. There's no difference between actually taking the action or thinking about doing the action. There's a crime either way. And they're going to find you and they're going to punish you for it. So it's just easier just to confess because they're going to be beating you anyway. in the party is infallible. They're going to have their way. It's no use to stick up for your guns, stick to your principles. No, I did not do this. The party's going to be right in the very end. On page 250, we also see that Winston kind of slips into a little bit of a dream state before we are introduced to O'Brien. So the dream he's having is he's going to room 101. He was rolling down a mighty corridor. He's confessing to everything. He's relating the entire history of his life to an audience who knew it already. With him were guards, other questioners, men in white coats, O'Brien, Julia, Mr. Sherrington, all rolling down the corridor together, shouting with laughter. Everything was all right. There was no more pain. The last detail of his life was laid bare, understood, forgiven. And then it seems like he kind of wakes up again. He's up from his plank bed. He's hearing O'Brien's voice. And then O'Brien is going to start speaking. O'Brien's going to start speaking, and now they're going to get into their conversation. Winston hears O'Brien's voice, and it's not a yelling voice like the guards are doing or the party intellectuals are doing and, trying to berate him and cause him torture. It's a calming voice. He says to Winston, "I shall make you perfect. Don't worry, Winston," he says. "You are in my keeping for 7 years. I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." So a couple things. We're going to have a discussion question about this. Remember the look that O'Brien gave Winston back in chapter 1? That was all a lie. And even before chapter 1, before all this, they have been keeping tabs on Winston for I don't know how long. They have been keeping tabs on Winston ever since he started thinking these revolutionary thoughts. And maybe as a science experiment. As a science experiment to see, hey, if we let this guy go down this road, can we successfully bring him back to loving the party? Whew. But Winston never had a chance. All of it. O'Brien, meeting with O'Brien, getting the room in Sherrington's shop, thinking that he's safe in a private place. Now, they knew it. There is no escape. There is no escape. I wouldn't be surprised they had microphones or cameras out there in the countryside where him and Julia met. Crazy. So O'Brien's speaking to him. He's talking to him about this, and O'Brien has his hands on a lever that is attached to a dial. And when he moves the lever, Winston experiences some pain. And Winston is kind of caught off guard by it. It feels like his joints are being torn apart. And O'Brien kind of calls him out for it because O'Brien knows exactly what he's thinking. He's going to call out Winston's thoughts throughout this whole dialogue for the rest of the chapter. And he actually tells him, you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, your joints are about to split apart. And he says that was only 40. You can see the numbers on this dial run up to 100. And he tells Winston, if you attempt to prevaricate or even fall below your usual level of intelligence, you will cry out with pain. Do you understand that? So he's letting Winston know, I'm going to be asking you some questions. If you don't answer truthfully, this lever is getting turned on. So that's what's going to be happening here. The power to inflict pain if Winston tells any lies, attempts to prevaricate, which is deviate from the truth or fall below the usual level of intelligence. Winston does not see O'Brien like he does the guards or the other party intellectuals. He sees him as a teacher rather than a punisher. He knows that his life, his pain lies with O'Brien, and O'Brien's not just going to zap him. O'Brien actually is showing some mercy. Hey, just be honest with me. I don't have to shock you. And this is where they again mention how they will meet in the place where there is no darkness. And Winston's kind of looking around him and he realizes, oh my gosh, this is the place. Because there is no darkness and the lights are always on. This is the place. And where are they? We'll find out in a second, but they're in the ministry of love. Ministry of love. Totally not what I expected the ministry of love to be. I thought the ministry of love had to do with like relationships and stuff, and maybe like relationships and like getting party members to marry and such, reproduction and like having kids. But turns out it's what Winston is here for, which is to get rehabilitated, it seems like. So O'Brien starts to lecture Winston. He says, you are mentally deranged and there's something wrong with you. You have this defective memory and we need to fix that. Because Winston believes certain things like the Jones, Aaronson, and Rutherford picture. Right? Winston has mentioned how the party didn't invent airplanes. The party used to be at war with somebody else, so he knows some certain things that are true, but O'Brien's calling them defective. No, that's not right in light of the party. And again, the party is infallible. So O'Brien asks Winston a simple question here. Who is Oceania at war with? And Winston answers, when I was arrested, Oceania was at war with East Asia. And then O'Brien asks him, and Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, has it not? And how does Winston answer that? I remember that until only a week before I was arrested, we were not at war with East Asia at all. We were in alliance with them. The war was against Eurasia. And O'Brien stops him. See, that wasn't really the right answer that he was looking for, but at least he's truthful in his usual level of intelligence. So next, O'Brien's going to show him the photo of Jones, Rutherford, and Aaronson. He shows it to him as proof that Winston was correct in that the photo existed and the men existed. But O'Brien throws it away. He throws it in a close-by memory hole. And Winston is livid. He's like, oh my gosh, it existed. You saw it. And O'Brien says, I don't remember it. It never existed. And Winston realizes that he can't win in this situation. This is doublethink at its finest. It says he had a feeling of deadly helplessness. He can't win. He's not in that position of power. So next, O'Brien is going to ask him to repeat the party slogan about the past. So that's what Winston does. He who controls the past controls the future, and then who controls the present controls the past. O'Brien next asks him, is it your opinion, Winston, that the past has real existence? Does it exist in space? And Winston replies that it does exist, but it exists in records and memory. And O'Brien rebuts that, yes, in memory. Okay, you're onto something here, Winston. That's true. But we control all the records and we control all the memories. Then we control the past. And Winston replies, how can you really do this? How can you control memory? You failed to control Winston's memory. Because I remember these things. I remember Rutherford, Jones, and Aaronson I remember that we used to be in a war with a completely different country. And O'Brien turns it back on him. This is kind of like another sort of doublethink where O'Brien turns it back on him and says, no, that your memory is your fault. You are misremembering. That's your sole responsibility. And that's what you're here for, is to get that corrected. And O'Brien mentions how reality is not self-evident. It's not something subjective or external existing in its own right. Reality relies on the party. It exists with the party. It's whatever the party says. So in this case, the reality is those guys never existed. Oceania was never at war with Eurasia. That's the reality. We continue on. He then asks Winston, do you remember writing freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4? And Winston says yes. So now here's the big test. O'Brien holds up his hand, asks him how many fingers is he holding up, and he is holding up 4 fingers. And it says the thumb is hidden, so he's holding up 4 fingers. Winston says 4, but then O'Brien says if the party says there's 5, how many do we have? Winston still says 4, and here's where O'Brien gets a little bit pissed off, and he turns up that dial. It's not 4, it's 5, because the party said so. And he tells Winston, you need to become sane. You need to see that I am holding up 5 fingers. And he asks him again. And he turns up the dial more because he says again, there's 4. When really the party is saying there's 5. There are 5 fingers. And Winston says, how can I say anything else? You're not holding up 5. And he just keeps turning it up. And Winston's he's in tons of pain. He's saying, stop it. 4. How many fingers, Winston? 5. And even when Winston says 5, O'Brien doesn't stop because he says, you are lying. You still think there are 4. That's the problem. That's essentially how he's been living, saying one thing, thinking another. It gets to the point where he's getting shocked so much and being asked about it multiple times that Winston eventually says, I suppose there are 4. I would see 5 if I could. I am trying to see 5. So he's actually starting to believe in this 5-finger thing, that he's holding up 5 fingers. Let's continue on because this is going on. I'm on page 260. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? I don't know. You will kill me if I do that again. 4, 5, 6, in all honesty. I don't know. Better, said O'Brien. So he's starting to question it. This is where a nice dose of medicine comes in, and this healing warmth radiates through Winston's body. He gets some sort of injection. I don't know what it is. And it says he opens his eyes as he looks up gratefully out at O'Brien. And it says that he has started to love O'Brien. He sees O'Brien as a friend. So this is where the love part comes in the ministry of love. They're not punishing people here. They're curing them. They're making them love the party again. Because this is what O'Brien asked Winston. Do you know where you're at? And he says, I'm probably in the ministry of love. And he asks him, what do you think we do here? I think you make people confess. I think you punish people here. And he says, no. No, not merely to extract your confession nor to punish you. Should I tell you why we have brought you here? To cure you, to make you sane. Will you understand, Winston? We bring you to this place. No one whom we bring to this place ever leaves our hands uncured We are not interested in the stupid crimes that you have committed. The thought is all we care about. We don't care that you committed the crimes. It's just the fact that you thought about it, which means that you are defective. You need to think like everybody else. You need to think like the party is the absolute source of truth. And this is where he gets into some mistakes that other totalitarian governments, countries, what have you, have made mistakes in the past. They have never gotten to the thought. So he gives a couple examples here about the Inquisition and the Nazis and the Russian communists, how they would burn and punish people for believing things against their government. But what ends up happening is the people that they punish end up becoming martyrs. They end up becoming somebody who dies for a certain principle, and then that glory rests with them and then gets eventually seen by other people to then take up the same act, because they see, oh my gosh, there's a lot of glory in being this victim of this heinous government that I'm going to take part in it too. So it happened in the Inquisition. It happened with the Nazis and the Russian communists, although they tried to take it one step further and they did better. But still, their victims became martyrs. With the party, they chose not to make the same mistakes as those two. The mistakes that the other two made in the Inquisition and the Nazis and the Russian communists was that their confessions and the people died still believing in their cause. With the party, people died and they don't believe in their cause because everything they're confessing to is true. The dead do not rise up against them. The people surrender by their own free will. They know that they are wrong. But in the other two examples from history, the people died still thinking that they weren't wrong. But now, everybody is wrong except the party, or the party is the absolute source of truth. The ultimate goal of the party is, if you walk to your death, it's not as a heretic. You actually believe you did something wrong because the party said it was. And that's not the case in the other two examples. O'Brien explains it like this. It's thou shalt not versus thou shalt versus thou art. And the party is all about thou art. In the first two examples, the Inquisition and the Nazis and communists, it was about thou shalt not. With the party, it's thou art. Do you guys see the difference there? That you already are. You are what the party says you are. We're not making you do anything. Next, let's move ahead. Move ahead to page 265. Squeeze you empty and fill you with ourselves. So now we get to kind of the goal of what they're trying to do to Winston here. Eradicate all those thoughts and then fill Winston back up with the thoughts of the party and loving the party. And how do they do this? They take that pain machine and they turn it up to 3,000. And O'Brien mentions, we shall squeeze you empty and then fill you with ourselves. He motions to a guy in a white coat. And O'Brien sits next to Winston, beside the bed, and he says 3,000. Two soft pads, which felt slightly moist, clamped down against themselves on Winston's temples. And he says, Winston, this time this will not hurt. And at that moment, Winston feels a devastating explosion. A blinding flash of light. Winston was not hurt, only prostrated. Although he was lying on his back when the thing happened, he had a curious feeling that he had been knocked into that position. A terrific, painless blow. And O'Brien's talking to him through this. It will not last. Look me in the eyes. What country is Oceania at war with? And O'Brien just starts like recycling these questions, and he's asking them, and Winston says, I don't really remember. Oceania is at war with East Asia, says O'Brien. Do you remember that now? Oh, yeah, okay. I remember that. And Winston at this point is not really giving him just the correct answers. He's actually believing in the answers. Next thing you know, O'Brien's asking about the finger test. Just now when I held up my fingers, you saw 5 fingers. Do you remember that? O'Brien holds up his fingers again. Only 4 are present, the thumb concealed. He asks him, do you see 5 fingers? And yes. Oh, now I see 5 fingers. And it says, and he did see them for a fleeting instant before the scenery of his mind changed. He saw 5 fingers and there was no deformity. It's starting to become a reality for him. With each new suggestion of O'Brien's had filled up a patch of emptiness and become absolute truth, and when 2 and 2 could have been 3 as easily as 5, so they have now filled his head. They are starting to fill his head with the propaganda of the party, making him whole again, wiping the slate clean. I'm assuming that's what that shock was, the pads on his head, to shock him into like a reset, and now to fill him back up with the party's truth. Now we're getting to the end, and now Winston gets to ask O'Brien some questions. And O'Brien mentions how I enjoy talking to you. He says, do you remember writing in your diary that it did not matter whether I was a friend or an enemy, since I was at least a person who understood you and could be talked to? You were right. I enjoy talking to you, says O'Brien. And he says, before we bring this session to a close, ask me any questions you like. So he does. Winston asks him a couple questions. What have you done with Julia? And he says everything has been burned out of her. It was a perfect conversation, a textbook case. Winston says, oh my gosh, you tortured her. And O'Brien just says, next question. So they probably did exactly what they did to Winston, to Julia. And it probably went just as smoothly as it did with Winston. Next, Winston asks an interesting question. Does Big Brother exist? And O'Brien says, well, of course he exists. It's the embodiment of the party. But then Winston asks an interesting question here. Does he exist in the same way that I exist? As in present, live, flesh and skin. And O'Brien says, you do not exist. And Winston, ultimately, he feels a sense of helplessness. He does not exist. The party exists. And he is a part of that party. But Winston Smith does not exist anymore. And Winston says, I think I exist. I'm conscious of my own identity. In that sense, does Big Brother exist? And O'Brien basically tells him, drop it. It's of no importance. He exists. You know what that tells me? Big Brother was all a lie. Big Brother is not a real person. It's just an image that people can look up to that will never die. Winston asks him, will Big Brother ever die? Of course not. How could he die? The party's infallible. Big Brother has always been, always will be, the ultimate source of truth. That's how he can never die, because he's an idea. He's not an actual person. Again, the party doesn't care about bloodlines. The bloodlines come and go. No, the idea persists. I mean, the next question Winston asks, does the Brotherhood exist? And O'Brien says that you will never know. If we choose to set you free when you have finished with you and you live to be 90 years old, still you will never learn whether the answer to that question is a yes or no. The Brotherhood, let me tell you guys, it never existed either. So my opinion. Brotherhood never existed. It was all done by the party to possibly root out people like Winston who believe in it. And then to bring those people in to be rehabbed in the ministry of love, to keep the party propaganda going and keeping everybody on the same page. Last question. Winston asks, what is in room 101? And O'Brien replies, you know what is in room 101, Winston. Everyone knows what's in room 101. And then the needle jerks in Winston's arms and he falls into a deep sleep. And that's where we end Chapter 3, Part 2. An interesting dialogue between O'Brien and Winston. We've learned a lot. Wow. Here are the discussion questions. Whew. I will get a blog post up for this, and that link will be in the description. Let me know what you think and your thoughts on Chapter 3, Part 2. And we will be back with Chapter 3, Part 3 next time. We are getting very close to the book. We only have about 40 pages left. So, guys, thank you very much for listening this far. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.